Last week, we learned about our inner self-talk and how the things that we say to ourselves inside our head really affects our behavior and our attitude. And we realized we could have some key attitude adjustments if we just change the narrative about ourselves and about hope as opposed to defeat, if we change that narrative inside our head. Well, today, catch the vision of improving your marriage, changing your marriage as you change your inner spouse talk. That's right, the things that you mutter about your spouse inside your head. And for those of you who are not married, this would really apply to any relationship, any significant relationship. It could be the things you're muttering inside your head about your mother-in-law or your sister or whatever it is, right? It's whatever you're muttering inside your head. And if you're married, I can almost guarantee that you sometimes have a subtle negative narrative going on inside your head about your husband. And the words you speak in your head about your husband will shape the way that you interact with your husband. As Proverbs 18:21 says, the tongue holds the power of life and death. And it really does. Even the things that are said inside your head, they have the power of life and death. And this is the first part of the blank if you're following along with the lesson handout. Your internal narrative about your husband is either going to bring life to your marriage or death. Let me just say that again, because I found this to be so true in my own marriage. The internal narrative, in other words, the story you're telling yourself inside your head about your husband, is either going to bring life to your marriage or bring death. You get to choose. And I know some of you right now, you might be in a kind of painful position with your husband. Maybe he's done something again to break your heart. And you're like, I don't feel like changing the narrative inside my head. I don't like him. He has disappointed me, that loser. But how's that working for you? How is that working for you? Is this improving your marriage at all? Is this really going to end up leading to a restored marriage, a healthy marriage? I think we all know the answer is no. So again, we get to change the narrative inside our heads. In fact, as I was praying about this lesson, I sensed the Lord wanting me to tell you this. The things you say about your husband inside your head will set the trajectory of your marriage. The things you say inside your head about your husband will set the trajectory for your marriage. It's either going to be the trajectory up to a healthy marriage or the trajectory down to a sinking marriage. Which do you want? Because really the choice is up to you. I'm not making you change the narrative inside your head. God's not making you change the narrative inside your head. But don't you want a healthy marriage, a better marriage? Then maybe we need to change the things we're saying inside our heads. This is why we have to be diligent about applying 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5, which says, we take every thought captive and make it obedient to Christ. In that moment, when negative, critical, harsh words pop into our heads about our husbands, we have to stop and purposely change our words. I want to give us 2 Bible verses to guide us in terms of what we should be saying inside our heads about our husbands, even when they have fallen short of being perfect, which happens regularly, doesn't it? We need not go into that. We all know that our husbands are not perfect. But here are 2 Bible verses that can shape the narrative inside our heads, that should be a guide for what we're saying inside our heads. Ephesians 4, verse 2. Be completely humble, which means we don't think we're so much better than him. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Now see, I like when God does that for me. Don't you? Don't you like it when people are really patient with you and gentle? They bear with you when you kind of mess up? Maybe we should be doing the same thing toward our husbands, realizing they also are less than perfect. Here's another verse to guide us. Ephesians 4:32. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as Christ forgave you. So, looking at the components of these 2 verses, ask yourself this. Is my inner spouse talk humble? Is my inner spouse talk compassionate? Is my inner spouse talk gentle toward my husband? Is my inner spouse talk patient? Because I realize my husband is a work in progress in God's hands. Is my inner spouse talk kind? Is my inner spouse talk forgiving? Yeah, I probably failed at all of those recently. How about you? And yet, this is how God treats us. I don't know if God's muttering in his head about me, but maybe he's saying it out loud. I don't know. But I don't think he's saying, that stupid Debbie Chavez. She is such a loser. She'll never get it right. She breaks my heart every day. What a horrible mess up. I don't think God talks to me like, or talks about me like that. I don't think he's muttering those kinds of things in his head, right? Maybe we need to be more Christ-like in the way we talk about our husbands in our heads. And remember, when I said the words that you say inside your head about your husband will set the trajectory of your marriage, here's how this works. If you allow your inner spouse talk to be negative, critical, defeated, you become defeated in your marriage. See, if you let that inner spouse talk be hopeless, critical, negative, defeated, you will become defeated in your marriage. Proverbs 23:7 says, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. So when you have those hopeless thoughts about your husband, your marriage will be hopeless because you basically said, it's hopeless. Do you see what I mean? As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. That's Proverbs 23:7. So let me just give you some real specific examples. I wrote down a bunch so that we could just kind of grasp this. If you tell yourself you will never get over the fact that your husband was looking at pornography again. If you say, I'll never get over this, you will never get over this. You already told yourself, I'll never get over this. See how that works? See how that's connected? What you say inside your head shapes your action, shapes your attitude, shapes your behavior. If you tell yourself, you're not in love with your husband anymore, I don't love him anymore, I'm not in love with him anymore, you won't feel lovey-dovey toward your husband. You've already told yourself, I don't love him anymore. If you tell yourself, I'm not sexy to my husband, you will not carry yourself as if you're sexy with your husband. If you tell yourself in your head that your husband is a total jerk, you will view him constantly as a total jerk because you've already told it. I mean, you're just telling yourself this over and over again, and it's shaping your attitude, your perspective, your opinion, and then your behavior as well. I did this, ladies, in my first marriage. That's why I know this is true. I was constantly having this narrative running in my head, running down my husband. He's hopeless, he's a jerk. And so I constantly viewed him that way, and it shaped my decisions, my behavior, the whole thing. Here's a big one. If you tell yourself, I deserve a different husband, you will likely get a different husband, if you know what I mean. You'll likely end up in divorce to this one. Because what we think in our heads, what we're telling ourselves over and over again in our heads, it shapes our perspective, our attitude, and then our behavior. However, let's contrast that. Speaking compassionate, gracious words inside your head about your husband will cause you to be more content and more hopeful in your marriage. Don't we actually want that? I know some of you are like, I don't want to even be content. He's been such a disappointment to me. Okay, again, you get to choose. You get to choose. I'm just saying eventually you might want to choose contentment. I'm just saying that seems like a better choice. And it starts with speaking compassionate, gracious words inside your head about your husband, which again causes you to be more content and hopeful. Let me give you some specific examples of what this might be like. If you remind yourself that your husband did not mean to hurt you by his choices, by his behavior, if you remind yourself he didn't mean to hurt me, you will rebound much more easily from minor offenses, even major offenses. You will rebound much more quickly if the narrative in your head is, I know he didn't mean to hurt me. Again, you will rebound so much more quickly. If you remind yourself that your husband is a work in progress, the same as you are, you will be much more gracious and patient with him. If you remind yourself of your husband's good qualities, Even when you're frustrated with him, if you all of a sudden start reminding yourself in your head, well, you know what? He's no longer drinking, or he does go to church with me when we're able to go to church. He does take time to play with the kids. If you start reminding yourself of some of those good qualities, even when you're frustrated with him, you'll calm down much quicker. Your attitude will suddenly shift toward him. It'll be a better attitude. See how this works? Now, I need to stop for just a second and give a little caveat here. This doesn't mean that you let sinful behavior slide and say, oh, it doesn't really matter that he's having an affair. It doesn't really matter that he's doing illegal drugs. Oh, well, I should just say nice things about him. No, we're not saying that. Of course not. You still need to confront, and maybe make specific requests for change, and maybe even set some really firm boundaries on sinful behavior. But even then, ladies, even then, you can say hopeful, compassionate things about your husband in your head. You can say hopeful, compassionate things inside your head, even when you're setting boundaries, even when you're asking him to change some really wrong behavior. Let me give you an example. Let's say he's broken your heart with looking at pornography again, or getting, drunk into a horrible drunken rampage or something, I don't know, whatever. And, you're totally disappointed. You might even be setting boundaries, but inside your head you say, I know he's not trying to hurt me on purpose. He has deep emotional wounds that he needs to tend to, that need to be healed, that are causing him to make these poor choices where he's trying to, self-medicate in an unhealthy way. I'm not going to tolerate this behavior, but I know there's a good man inside there. See how you're telling yourself things inside your head that lead to hope, that lead to compassion. You're still setting boundaries, but you're also changing the narrative inside your head. You have a compassionate narrative, a hopeful narrative. Here's another example. If he's willing to get the help he needs to work on these personal problems, we can put our marriage back together, and it could be better than ever. Can you imagine how many marriages would be changed if we just said that? When our husband disappoints us, makes a poor choice, we say this inside our heads. If he's willing to get the help he needs to work on this problem, this personal problem, we can put our marriage back together, and it could be better than ever. Whew! Now that's hopeful, right? Now last week we talked about coaching our souls like King David often did in the book of Psalms. He did this so many places in the Psalms. Psalm 43 is an example, Psalm 42, Psalm 103, you can read them for yourself. He would tell his soul how to think. And that changed everything. He would remind himself of the promises of God. He would remind his soul of what was true, even when he was in a world of hurt. And it changed everything. Well, we can coach our souls to talk differently about our husbands, which leads to different thinking about our spouse, which leads to an actual change in the way we interact with our spouse, which leads to a better marriage. I just have to back up and say that all over again because you got to catch this. You got to catch this. We can coach our souls to talk differently about our spouse, which leads to thinking differently about our spouse, which leads to an actual change in the way we interact with our spouse, which leads to a better marriage. Ha! I practice this all the time in my marriage because even now, I know you ladies are not going to believe this, but my husband is not perfect. Sometimes he disappoints me. Sometimes on a daily basis, I'm like, bah, right? And I can go there so quick in my head. Why did I even marry this man? I can go there. I'll just be honest. But I've learned to turn the narrative around. I've learned to think differently, to think about his good qualities, to remind myself that he's a work in progress, that the Lord's still working on him, that he has issues from his childhood that are still painful, that are causing him to act this way or do this thing. And as I change that narrative in my head, I have more compassion. I'm not saying I don't request changes in behavior, but I have more compassion. I have more hope. It leads to a better marriage. So again, let me just kind of give some examples on how we can shift things around inside our heads. What if you've been a sarcastic, critical wife in the past, but now when your husband doesn't do something right, you coach your soul and say something like this: I am choosing to talk in a loving, gentle, respectful way to my husband because this will improve our relationship. Just think about that. You've just coached your soul. You've kind of had this internal narrative in your head change to saying, I'm choosing to talk in a loving, gentle voice with respectful way to my husband because this will improve our relationship. What if you've been a bossy, domineering wife in the past, a controlling wife in the past, but now you coach your soul every morning and you say this inside your head, I am a wife who chooses to honor my husband by asking his opinion on things and really listening to him, and I'm so excited to see how this will improve our marriage. So excited. I can't wait to see how this is going to improve our marriage. See how that changes everything? What if you've allowed huge resentment to build against your husband, maybe partly because you've been a conflict avoider? I know I've been a conflict avoider in the past. But now, when your husband disappoints you, you coach your soul and you say to yourself, I am a confident woman who has Jesus by my side, so I do have the courage to voice my concerns and request change. What if you've dreaded having sex with your husband due to childhood abuse or something like that, but now, when you know your husband's in the mood, you coach your soul by saying something like this, thank you, Lord, that you can heal and redeem all of my past, and I'm going to totally enjoy being intimate with my husband. Coaching your soul, ladies. What if you let angry, disrespectful words spew out against your husband when upset in the past, but now you coach your soul by saying to yourself, I always pause when I'm upset, and then I choose a gentle, loving voice with my husband because this will end up so much better when I do that. Coaching your soul. It comes down to this. What language do you speak during your inner spouse talk? What language do you speak when you're engaging in this inner spouse talk? The language of despair or the language of hope? We're speaking one of those. We're speaking one of those languages. Either the language of despair or the language of hope. You get to choose. Ladies, you get to choose how you will internally narrate the story of your marriage. We're doing it. We are telling a story inside our heads. We're narrating the story of our marriage inside our heads. But is it with the language of despair or the language of hope? Let me give you some more examples. I'm full of examples today. If your husband trips up and starts looking at porn again after he said he wouldn't do that anymore, you can decide to catastrophize that event. Do you know what I mean? The sky is falling. You can catastrophize that event as you internally narrate your story. You can choose the language of despair. You can totally do that. But if you do, you will say things like this. He doesn't really love me. I married the wrong person. I'm stuck in a hopeless marriage. I'll never be able to trust him again. I'll never get over this. He is a complete jerk. I will never respect him again. You can say all of those things as you internally narrate that story in your head, right? Or you can internally narrate that exact same event in a different way using the language of hope, which would sound something like this. This really hurts, but I know God will teach me something really important through this experience that will cause me to become more Christ-like. I know God is going to show me how to handle this situation. My husband isn't perfect, but I'm not a perfect woman either, so I'm going to give him the same kind of grace I want when I mess up. I'm sure he didn't mean to hurt me. I bet there's a reason he did what he did. He's probably trying to medicate some kind of internal pain. I will pray for God to show him the path to healing. See how we took the same exact event, the husband looking at pornography again, and instead of catastrophizing it and speaking the language of despair, we coached our soul, we changed the internal narrative, and we started speaking the language of hope and compassion. Here's another example. Let's say your husband has started drinking too much again after saying he was going to stop. You can catastrophize that event as you internally narrate this story. You can choose to use the language of despair, and if you do, it would sound something like this. This is hopeless. I'm done with him. He is never, ever going to change. He cares more about alcohol than he does about our family. I mean, you can go on and on with the language of despair. Or you can narrate that exact same event in a different way, using the language of hope. You could say, I'm disappointed, but I know my husband has a good heart, and I'm going to work with him to find out what is causing him to make these choices. I trust God to teach me new things through this situation. I totally believe God will guide me so that I know how to handle this. See how one is, they're just completely different, aren't they? The language of despair and the language of hope. Now notice that your inner spouse talk doesn't necessarily mean you're not going to take any action if your husband has sinned against you, but we do get to choose the language of hope. Romans 12:12. Paul reminds us to choose the language of hope. He says, be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. And I want to leave you with one more point to ponder, and I might have to read this like 3 times so you really digest it. It's a bit of research that I found super enlightening. It's a fascinating survey of couples, of married couples, done by marriage researcher Shanti Feldhahn. She's a Harvard-trained researcher, a Christian who does fabulous research. She interviewed over 1,000 couples and found that among spouses who were in struggling marriages, where they both said, we are struggling in our marriage, when a spouse was legitimately hurt by their mate, the spouse in those struggling marriages assumed that their mate either intended to hurt them or didn't really care about them. Interesting. However, among the surveyed couples who reported being in a highly happy marriage, they both said, we're in a highly happy marriage. When one of those spouses was legitimately hurt by the other, they refused to believe that their mate intended to hurt them, and they looked for the most generous explanation instead. That is fascinating, isn't it? I find that to be fascinating. They made the choice, instead of condemning that person and speaking the language of despair and saying this person is a filthy, rotten loser and they intended to hurt me, the couples in the happy marriages assumed that their spouse did not intend to hurt them, and they looked for the most generous explanation instead, and they had highly happy marriages. Isn't that something to ponder? I think we should ponder that together today. There you go. I hope this has been instrumental to you. As I'm speaking this over myself, it's like a reminder for myself as well. I want to choose the language of hope. How about you?